Hey everyone, welcome to Darkened Echo. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The storm had been threatening all evening, rolling over the ridgelines like a beast that refused to be seen, only heard. By the time Ranger Daniel Hayes received the call, the sun had already bled out behind the treetops, leaving the forest soaked in twilight. Dispatch had reported a complaint from two hikers who swore they heard screams echoing through the pines along an old maintenance trail that hadn't been patrolled in months. Daniel didn't like the timing. Thunder was already snapping close, and the fog creeping in from the valley made the road look like a ghost's breath across the ground. Still, duty was duty. He took his flashlight, radio, and sidearm, then hiked into the forest where the path narrowed into darkness. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. The usual chorus of crickets and owls was gone. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Half a mile in, he noticed boot prints in the mud. At first, they looked ordinary, but then he realized something unsettling. The footprints continued for about 20 steps, and then just stopped. No turn, no backtrack, no sign of someone leaving the trail. They ended mid-stride, as though the hiker had been plucked out of existence. Daniel crouched down, sweeping his light across the earth. That's when he saw it. Deep gouges carved into the dirt, almost like claw marks, dragging outward from where the prints ended. They went into the brush, but didn't return. He reached for his radio, but all he got was static. Not even a crackle of voice from dispatch. He tapped the side, tried again. Nothing. The storm overhead seemed to be swallowing every signal. The forest pressed closer around him. The trees looked like they were leaning inward, their trunks forming a wall of shadow. That's when he heard it. A faint, wet sound, like someone taking a long, heavy breath right behind him. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through fog and branches, but the trail was empty. His pulse hammered as the sound faded into the trees, replaced by the distant roll of thunder. And then, from somewhere ahead on the trail, came a scream. Not just human, something wrong about it. It started high and shrill, then cracked into a guttural growl that made his stomach knot. Daniel should have turned back. Every instinct told him to, but he forced his boots forward, deeper into the forest, until he reached a clearing where the trail ended abruptly at a sheer cliff. There, lying in the mud, was a single hiking boot. Its laces were torn, its leather soaked through as though it had been submerged in water. Next to it was a trail of blood leading toward the edge. Daniel stepped closer, raising his light. The storm roared, lightning splitting the sky. For a moment, he thought he saw something moving just beyond the cliff's edge. A figure, crouched low, its limbs too long, its head jerking unnaturally as though sniffing the air. The next second, the thing was gone. Daniel backed away, boots slipping in the mud, the sound of static still hissing from his useless radio. Behind him, the forest seemed alive again, but not with birds or animals. With whispers, faint, echoing voices weaving through the trees. Some sounded like children, some sounded like screams, and then silence. Only the storm remained, pounding the forest in sheets of rain. Daniel would never be able to explain what he saw that night. But the hikers who called it in, they never returned to the ranger station to follow up. Their names were never logged. Their faces were never seen again. It was as if they had vanished into the trail the same way the footprints did, swallowed whole by something the forest didn't want him to understand. The rain had eased, but the forest remained heavy with mist, clinging to the trunks like cobwebs. Ranger Daniel Hayes had barely slept since the last incident. Dispatch kept sending him to check on routine calls, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, waiting. It was during a late-night patrol along the northern ridge that he first saw it. Two eyes, glowing faintly red, staring from the tree-line. He froze, hand gripping his flashlight. The light trembled as he trained it on the shape. At first, he thought it was a deer, but deer didn't stand still for minutes. Unmoving, their gaze locked on him, and deer didn't growl low, deep, vibrating through the earth itself. Daniel flicked his radio again. Nothing. The static was thicker tonight, almost tactile, as if the forest itself had swallowed all sound. Then the eyes moved, slowly, methodically. They didn't run. They stalked. He climbed into his truck, heart hammering, tried to keep the headlights on the figure. But every time he turned a corner, it seemed closer, always staying just at the edge of vision. Tall, too tall, limbs that didn't bend right. By the time he reached the ranger outpost, Daniel's nerves were shredded. He swore he could feel the eyes burning into the back of his neck, even inside the locked building. That night, the forest whispered outside the windows. Leaves scraped along walls. Branches tapped like fingers. And from somewhere deep in the woods, that same guttural growl echoed, low and unending. Daniel never saw the thing again in person. Not that night. Not in the following weeks. But the tracks remained. Large, elongated, human-like, but wrong. Too long. Too many knuckles. Dragged across mud, snow, and gravel alike. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would catch a flash of movement beyond the pines, and the feeling of being watched would crush him like a stone pressing on his chest. Rangers who had worked the forest for decades warned him, don't look too long. Don't wander past dusk. The forest, it keeps its own. Daniel didn't know what it meant back then, but every night on patrol, he felt it. A presence just beyond the light, just beyond reason, waiting. And in the darkness, waiting is enough. The storm had finally passed, leaving the forest drenched and shrouded in mist. Every tree dripped water like a leaky roof, and the ground was soft, sucking at Ranger Daniel Hayes' boots with every step. It was early morning, but the sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy. Even the birds were silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He had received a call from a ranger station several miles north about a missing camper, a teenage boy who had wandered into the forest with his family. They'd reported that he had gone out to explore a nearby trail, but never returned. His parents described him as adventurous, maybe even reckless, but nothing could justify vanishing without a trace. Daniel arrived at the campsite to find it disturbingly intact. The family's tents were neatly pitched. Their belongings were orderly. Nothing had been disturbed, yet the boy was gone. His sleeping bag was still rolled neatly at the foot of the tent, and his backpack lay beside it. Even his water bottle stood upright, as though someone had just set it down. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Something was very wrong. He began following the faint trail leading away from the campsite, flashlight cutting through the lingering fog. The forest floor was dotted with broken twigs and footprints, small, human, but not quite matching the boy's size. They were elongated, too perfect, like someone had stretched them unnaturally. After 20 minutes of careful tracking, Daniel noticed something impossible. The footprints stopped at a shallow depression in the ground, flattened like something heavy had pressed there, and then vanished. No continuation, no drag marks, nothing. Just gone. His radio crackled. Static. Then, for a brief moment, a whisper, "Don't come closer." Daniel froze. He scanned the trees, heart racing. The sound was too quiet to have come through the radio normally. It was as if the forest itself spoke. He pressed on, adrenaline replacing fear for a moment. Around him, the fog thickened, curling like smoke around the tree trunks. Every step seemed to echo, yet when he stopped, it was too silent. No rustle of animals, no breeze in the leaves, just the muffled sound of his own breath and the dripping of water from branches. Then he saw it, a figure crouched among the ferns, motionless, too tall for a child, too thin, limbs long and twisted. Its head jerked unnaturally toward him, tilting at an impossible angle. Daniel froze, knowing that if he blinked, it might vanish, but the way it moved, it seemed aware of his fear. He whispered into his radio, calling for backup. No response. The figure shifted slightly, and Daniel's stomach knotted. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, were not human. Yet, there was something almost intelligent in their gaze, as if it were studying him, testing him. Then it darted into the mist, moving faster than any human could. Daniel ran after it, following broken branches and crushed underbrush. But every time he thought he was closing in, the figure would vanish just beyond the fog. Hours seemed to pass in minutes. His flashlight began to flicker, And then he reached a clearing and froze. The boy's tent had been moved. The sleeping bag was ripped open, scattered across the ground. But the boy, gone. Nothing remained except deep gouges in the mud, jagged and irregular, forming a spiral that seemed to lead nowhere. Daniel stepped back, chest heaving. That's when he heard it, a low, wet breathing, coming from all directions at once. The forest itself seemed to be closing in, and then, in a voice that chilled him to the bone, the whisper returned, "You shouldn't be here." He spun around, flashlight swinging wildly. Shadows moved among the trees, impossible shapes that stretched and twisted. One shape lunged, then vanished before he could react. The static in his radio grew louder, like a scream, masking the storm that had long since passed. Finally, with dawn breaking faintly through the fog, Daniel stumbled back to the ranger station, drenched and shaking. He never told anyone exactly what he saw. The boy was never found. Search parties combed the forest for days, leaving with nothing but broken branches, trampled ferns, and a lingering sense of wrongness that clung to the forest like a second skin. From that day forward, Daniel avoided the northern trails. Every time he drove past, he swore he could see faint movement in the fog, watching, waiting, reminding him that the forest keeps its own secrets, and sometimes it takes them. Weeks had passed since the disappearance of the camper, and the forest still held its silence like a thick, suffocating blanket. Ranger Daniel Hayes had learned to distrust it, to feel the tension in every swaying branch and the unsteady ground beneath his boots. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened one evening on a routine patrol. The call had come late. Another ranger, older and experienced, had gone missing while checking a remote trail in the eastern section of the park. His name was Tom Wilkes, a man who had spent decades in these woods and whose instincts were considered almost infallible. Yet on that night he vanished. Daniel drove along the winding dirt roads, fog curling over the asphalt like smoke rising from a fire, and felt a familiar pull of unease. Every tree seemed taller, closer. Every shadow seemed to twitch with purpose. He parked near the trailhead and took only a flashlight, the radio in his truck silent and useless, as usual. He followed the trail where Tom had last been seen. At first, it looked ordinary. Twisted roots, moss-covered stones, and the occasional animal track. But soon, the fog thickened, swallowing the path ahead. Daniel called out, his voice echoing faintly. "Tom? You there?" Nothing. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Then, through the mist, he saw a figure moving slowly, almost floating above the forest floor. It was Tom. His posture was stiff, unnatural. His boots made no sound against the wet leaves. Daniel ran toward him. "Tom, wait." The older ranger turned his head slowly, eyes wide but empty, expressionless. Then he whispered, almost mechanically, "Don't come in here, don't let it see you." Daniel's heart pounded. "See me? Who? What's out here?" But Tom didn't answer. He just continued forward, deeper into the fog. Daniel followed, cautiously, the forest around him shifting in impossible ways. Branches seemed to bend unnaturally, roots appeared to writhe like serpents underfoot, and shadows stretched beyond reason. Suddenly, the figure vanished. Not behind a tree, not into the fog, just vanished. Daniel called again, louder this time, but the only response was a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. The fog thickened into a white wall, pressing against him. Panic rose in Daniel's chest as he realized he could no longer see the trail. The forest had changed. The familiar path was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of trees that seemed to close in, guiding him toward something. Hours, or was it minutes, passed as he stumbled blindly. And then he heard it. Tom's voice, distant, trembling. "It's here, it's watching." Daniel followed the sound, praying he would reach the ranger, but the fog twisted around him like hands, pulling, blocking, guiding him further from safety. Finally, he broke through into a small clearing. The ground was covered in strange, circular patterns pressed into the soil, almost like giant claw marks pressed repeatedly. And in the center, a small, dark figure crouched, shivering. It wasn't Tom, but Daniel knew immediately it had been him once. And for a brief moment, their eyes met, hollow, unrecognizable, a warning and a plea. The forest whispered again, low, wet, impossibly close. Daniel felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him, countless, patient, ancient. He stumbled backward, fear clawing at him like ice. When he finally emerged from the fog, dragging himself to the road, Tom was gone, completely gone. The patterns in the soil had vanished as though they had never existed. But Daniel would never forget the sound of that whispering, the way the fog seemed alive, and the cold, empty stare of the man who had walked into the forest and never returned. That night, he sat by the ranger station window, listening to the wind sigh through the trees. Every shadow outside felt like it was waiting, watching, keeping its own secrets. And Daniel understood something he had not before. The forest doesn't just take people. It waits for them to wander too far, to look too long, to step beyond what is safe. And if it does, it never forgets. The abandoned fire lookout tower had stood for decades on the ridge overlooking the eastern forest. Long and used, its wood weathered and splintered, the paint peeling like dead skin. Rangers avoided it, calling it cursed, a place where the forest seemed to behave differently. But for Ranger Daniel Hayes, curiosity and duty often blurred. Tonight, he would find out why the tower was off limits. The climb up the narrow trail was treacherous. Fog rolled through the trees in thick blankets, dampening sound and masking the already dim moonlight. Each step on the wet leaves and roots threatened to send him sliding back down the slope. The forest seemed to hold its breath as he climbed, branches scratching his jacket like fingers trying to hold him back. By the time he reached the base of the tower, the wind had picked up, howling through the trees like lost souls. The tower itself looked alive. Shadows shifted across the support beams, and the faintest creak made it feel as if it were breathing. Daniel shook off the unease and began climbing the ladder, each rung groaning under his weight. At the top, the view should have been breathtaking. Instead, the forest stretched endlessly, gray and silent, almost unreal in the moonlight. Daniel set down his flashlight and radio, surveying the surroundings. That's when he heard it, a faint tapping, coming from the ladder below. Slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was counting steps. He froze, heart hammering. The sound stopped. Then, a whisper, almost lost in the wind. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel scanned the area. No one. Only the fog swirling below, hugging the treetops, hiding whatever had made the sound. Minutes passed. He tried to calm his breathing. Then the tapping started again, louder this time, moving rhythmically, circling the tower. Daniel realized with dread, it was not on the ladder. It was coming from the forest around him, echoing off the trees in a way that made no sense. He shone his flashlight into the fog. Shadows moved between the trunks, too quick to be human, too deliberate to be animals. One shape broke free from the darkness, tall elongated limbs, hunched, gliding rather than walking. Its head twisted at an impossible angle, eyes reflecting the faint light. Daniel stumbled backward, crashing against the wooden railing. The figure did not approach openly. Instead, it circled the tower, silent but always watching. Every time he tried to move, the shadow mirrored him, staying just out of reach, just out of perception. Then came the sound of voice, not through the radio, not through the wind, but directly in his head. "Leave, or you will never leave." Panic surged. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and descended the ladder as quickly as he could, but each rung felt slippery, each step heavier. At the bottom, the shadow was gone. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. Only the fog remained, curling around him like fingers. When he reached his truck, the engine refused to start. He tried the radio again. Static. Only static. The forest seemed to lean in closer, swallowing sound and light. Finally, with a violent lurch, the engine caught. He drove down the ridge without looking back. Even now, weeks later, Daniel cannot forget the sensation of being watched, the whispering voice that spoke with intent, or the impossible shape circling the tower. Rangers say the tower is just old wood and wind, but Daniel knows better. He knows the forest as places that belong only to itself, places where it waits, patient and hungry, for anyone foolish enough to climb too high, look too long, or wander too far. Weeks had gone by since Daniel's encounter at the abandoned fire tower, yet the forest still clung to him like a shadow. Every time he patrolled the eastern ridge, he felt eyes watching him, felt the weight of something patient, ancient, and unseen. But nothing prepared him for what happened one night, when a call came about strange howling echoing from deep within the forest. The hikers who called him were terrified, claiming they had never heard anything like it. Screams that started low, almost mournful, then escalated into a high, piercing wail that rattled their bones. Daniel drove the winding path in near total darkness, fog curling across the headlights like ghostly tendrils. Even the forest seemed to hush in anticipation. He parked near the trailhead and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The howling started again, this time closer, weaving around the trees in impossible directions. Daniel's radio buzzed lightly, then went dead. Static hissed like teeth grinding in the fog. He began the hike cautiously, each step wet leaves and mud, every crack of a branch underfoot echoing unnaturally. The sound of the howls grew louder, yet he could not tell where it came from. To his trained ears, it seemed everywhere and nowhere at once. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. Daniel reached a small clearing where the trees formed a ring, almost like a natural amphitheater. The fog swirled thick here, damp and heavy. He thought he saw shapes in the mist, twisting and moving just beyond the light. Something large, hunched, and impossibly fast. He froze, holding his breath. Then the howling stopped. An oppressive silence fell. Even the wind dared not move. And then he heard it, a whisper from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come." Daniel swung his flashlight wildly. Nothing. Yet he felt it. Eyes, countless eyes, boring into him from the trees. He tried to call for backup, but the radio remained dead. The forest pressed in closer. The whispering grew, overlapping, almost like a chorus. "You cannot leave." Suddenly, movement in the trees, a flash of something tall, elongated, moving on limbs that bent wrong. Daniel's heart thudded, adrenaline surging. He ran, stumbling through roots and rocks, but the forest seemed alive. Paths twisted, returning him to the same clearing, time warping with every frantic step. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating a figure crouched on the forest floor, watching him. Its eyes glowed red, unmoving, yet its presence radiated menace. Daniel froze. The air seemed to hum, vibrating with a low, inhuman growl that shook him to the core. He finally collapsed near a fallen log, gasping, and waited for dawn. When the first faint light crept into the treetops, the forest seemed normal again. No figures, no howls, just mist, slowly rising, hiding whatever had stalked him. Daniel returned to the ranger station, haunted. He could not explain what he had seen or heard. Some nights, he swore he could still hear the faint echo of those impossible howls, carried on the wind like a memory that refuses to die. Rangers whispered warnings about that area. Stay away after dusk. The pines remember. But Daniel knew better. The forest didn't just remember. It waited. And when it chose, it would come for you. It had been several months since Daniel Hayes first encountered the strange phenomena in the eastern forest. Yet the park seemed only to grow darker, heavier with secrets. The ranger station was quieter than usual. Whispers circulated among the staff of missing patrols, rangers who had simply disappeared, leaving behind boots, radios, or their last known positions, but never a body. On a cold, overcast evening, Daniel was assigned to check a patrol route that had been repeatedly reported for unexplained disturbances. He drove along the winding dirt road, fog curling across his headlights, the air thick with the scent of wet pine and moss. The forest loomed around him like a living wall, shadows stretching unnaturally with every curve of the road. He parked at the trailhead, radio in hand, and began his patrol. The forest was unnervingly silent. No birds, no rustling of animals, nothing, just the muted crunch of his boots on wet leaves. Every step felt deliberate, as though the forest itself was guiding him. After nearly an hour, he noticed signs of another ranger's passage, broken branches, a dropped glove, footprints, but then, impossibly, the trail abruptly ended. The footprints simply stopped, vanishing into the earth. Daniel shined his flashlight around, heart hammering. The air felt heavier, charged with a pressure that seemed to push against him. And then he heard it, a radio signal, weak but unmistakable. A voice, familiar, trembling. It was Lieutenant Marlowe, another ranger who had vanished 2 weeks earlier. Daniel, help, don't leave. The voice crackled, then faded into static. Daniel's pulse raced. He called back, but only static replied. Moving cautiously, he followed the faint trail deeper into the forest. Fog rolled through the trees, thick and unrelenting, curling around his legs and obscuring every familiar landmark. The forest seemed alive, branches reaching toward him, snapping as if warning him to turn back. Suddenly, he saw movement, shadows flitting between the trunks, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. One figure stepped forward, tall, elongated limbs, crouched unnaturally, its head tilted sideways, eyes glowing faint red. Daniel's stomach dropped. He had seen this before. He tried to back away, but the forest seemed to twist around him. Every step forward felt like moving backward, paths looping impossibly, returning him to the same clearing over and over. The whispers returned, overlapping voices. You shouldn't be here. You cannot leave. Daniel's breathing grew ragged. He stumbled, falling into a shallow depression where the ground was flattened, almost as if something enormous had pressed into it. Mud clung to his clothes, and he felt a low vibration in the earth, like a heartbeat. Not his own. Then, from the fog, came a low growl, deep and resonant, shaking the very trees. Shapes moved closer, gliding silently, watching. Daniel's flashlight flickered, then went out. The forest was black, cold, alive. When the light finally returned, the clearing was empty. No signs of Lieutenant Marlowe, no shadows, nothing. Only the imprint of massive, twisted claws in the mud, spiraling outward in impossible directions. Daniel ran. He did not stop until he reached his truck, radio dead, heart pounding, drenched in sweat and mud. The forest behind him seemed to settle, quiet once more, as if it had merely been playing with him. But Daniel knew better. The vanished patrols, the whispers, the twisted shapes, these were not accidents or misadventures. They were warnings. The forest waits, patient, eternal, watching, and anyone who enters too deep may never leave. The forest had grown colder, darker, and more oppressive as autumn approached. Ranger Daniel Hayes had been back on patrol after the vanished patrol incident, but sleep offered little comfort. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping branch reminded him that the forest had a memory, a living, malevolent consciousness that waited for the unwary. Dispatch had received a call from a hiker who reported a small abandoned cabin deep within the eastern woods. Strange lights flickered inside at night, even though no one lived there. People who had ventured near claimed to hear whispers, footsteps, and occasionally a voice calling their name. Daniel was tasked to investigate, alone. The hiking was long, the trail obscured by fallen leaves and creeping fog. Every so often, he thought he saw figures moving between the trees, just shadows at first, but they seemed deliberate, tracking him. He told himself it was imagination, paranoia, the mind playing tricks. But instinct told him otherwise. By nightfall, he reached the clearing. The cabin sat crookedly on the forest floor, roof sagging, windows shattered. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though no fire burned. A chill gripped him. Every ranger he had ever known had stories about cabins like this, places the forest claimed, where reality blurred and people vanished. Daniel stepped closer, flashlights sweeping across the walls. The air inside smelled damp, rotten wood, and something faintly metallic like blood. Then he heard it, a soft, echoing voice, repeating over and over, faint but unmistakable. Daniel, Daniel, come closer. His heart pounded, but duty pressed him forward. The inside of the cabin was empty, or so it seemed. Dust coated the floor, cobwebs draped the corners. Yet in the far corner, he noticed a pile of clothing, small, like a child's, and beneath it, a pair of eyes, wide open, staring at him. He blinked. The eyes were gone. The whispering grew louder. Not just his name, but words he could not understand, spoken in a language that twisted his mind with fear. Shadows move along the walls, stretching, bending, sometimes forming shapes that seemed almost human, sometimes entirely monstrous. Then, something cold brushed against his shoulder. He spun, flashlight trembling. Nothing, but the temperature had dropped sharply. His breath came out in frosty clouds, and he could see faint footprints forming in the dust behind him. Footprints that hadn't been there before. The forest seemed to press into the cabin itself, leaning through broken windows, creeping along the walls. Daniel tried to call for backup, but the radio emitted only a high-pitched shriek. Panic clawed at him as the whispering voices merged into a deafening chorus, echoing off the walls. Leave, or join us. He stumbled backward, tripping over a rotting floorboard, crashing into the cabin door. The hinges groaned, the door slammed open, and a sudden gust of wind pushed him outside. The clearing was empty again, fog rolling thick across the ground. No cabin, no shadows, only the forest, silent but watching. Daniel returned to the ranger station, shaken beyond reason. He would not speak of what he saw inside, for fear of being called insane. Yet the memory haunted him. The whispers, the eyes, the cold, the footprints that appeared and vanished, as if the forest itself was alive and mocking him. Even now, he avoids the eastern woods at night. But sometimes, in the distance, when the fog is thick and the wind carries the scent of wet pine, he swears he can hear the cabin calling his name, waiting for him to return. The forest had grown stranger over the months. Ranger Daniel Hayes knew better than most that the eastern woods did not behave like a normal forest. Its shadows were heavier, the sounds deeper, and the fog, thick, suffocating fog, seemed to crawl across the ground, moving with a mind of its own. One night, a call came in about disorienting mist covering a section of the forest trail where hikers and even rangers had reported becoming lost for hours. Daniel drove cautiously, headlights barely cutting through the white haze that rolled along the dirt road. The smell of damp earth and pine was thick, almost choking, and the forest around him was silent. Eerily so. As he stepped onto the trail, the mist closed in. Within moments, he could barely see his own boots. Every tree seemed to loom closer, their trunks bending in unnatural ways, like the forest itself was corralling him. The sounds of wildlife had vanished. Even the wind refused to move. Then he heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, moving parallel to his path. Daniel swung his flashlight wildly, catching glimpses of elongated shadows darting between the trunks. His pulse raced. He knew better than to chase them. Whatever moved there was not human. The mist thickened, swirling at his ankles, climbing higher, stinging his eyes. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket and realized he had lost the trail. The familiar markers, the broken branches, even the scent of the forest, all gone. He was utterly disoriented. Then came a voice, low and guttural, almost merging with the fog itself. You shouldn't be here. Daniel froze. The mist swirled violently around him. Shapes emerged, tall, thin, limbs bending in impossible ways. They moved silently but purposefully, circling him like predators. He could hear their breathing, wet and heavy, close enough that he felt it on his skin. He tried to run, but the forest seemed to shift beneath him. Roots twisted into new positions. Trees appeared where none had been moments before, and the fog thickened, blinding him completely. Every step forward felt like stepping deeper into a trap. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Daniel's flashlight flickered, barely piercing the white swirl. Then, through the mist, he saw movement. A lone figure hunched over, dragging something across the forest floor. As the figure turned, he realized with horror it was another missing ranger, face pale, eyes hollow, mouth moving in silent screams. Before he could react, the figure vanished into the fog, leaving only a trail of strange, elongated footprints. The mist began to thin just as suddenly as it had appeared. Daniel found himself back at the trailhead, soaked, shaking, and breathless. The radio crackled weakly, a single distorted voice. "Never go in." Even now, Daniel avoids that section of the forest. He knows the mist can appear without warning, swallowing anyone foolish enough to wander too far. And deep in the trees, the shapes wait, patient and silent, ready to guide, or trap, the next unwary ranger. The forest was quiet that night, too quiet. Ranger Daniel Hayes had patrolled these woods for months, witnessed vanishings, shadows, and impossible phenomena, yet nothing had prepared him for what he would face on his final night of this rotation. The storm had returned, low clouds pressing against the treetops, lightning flickering across the ridge, illuminating the forest in brief, ghostly flashes. Daniel had been assigned to check the northern lookout post, an old platform where rangers once kept watch for fires. It had been abandoned for years, yet strange reports of glowing eyes, whispers, and figures in the fog had brought him here. As he hiked the trail, branches reached out like hands, fog curling across his path, and the familiar sense of being watched settled over him like a stone. Every step he took seemed heavier, the forest bending reality around him. By the time he reached the lookout, the wind screamed through the trees, rattling the platform. From the darkness below, faint lights flickered, shapes moving, circling, impossible to identify. Daniel set up his flashlight and radio, trying to maintain a semblance of control. And then he heard it, a voice, distant yet clear, almost carried by the wind. "You shouldn't be here. You will join us." He swung the flashlight wildly. Shapes darted between trees, tall, elongated, unnatural. Their movements were jerky yet deliberate, circling, observing, patient. Daniel's radio screeched, then went dead. The storm roared overhead, masking any sound, and in the chaos, he realized he wasn't alone on the platform. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, bending impossibly, stretching like liquid. Its eyes glowed faint red, unblinking, focused on him. Daniel stepped back, tripping over the platform's beams. The shadow crept closer, silent, almost gliding above the wood. He tried to run, but the platform seemed to stretch endlessly, ladders bending, steps leading nowhere. The fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, swallowing the forest behind him. Whispers surrounded him, voices overlapping, calling his name, calling others' names. Missing rangers, hikers, campers, all swallowed by the forest over the years. Then came the light, not from the storm, not from his flashlight, but from deep within the forest, glowing, pulsing like a heartbeat. The shadow paused, recoiling slightly as though aware of its power. Daniel stepped toward the light, hands shaking. It illuminated the clearing ahead, an array of footprints, twisted, elongated, spiraling toward an unseen center. And in the middle, nothing, just silence. A voice whispered, soft but insistent, in his mind, "Leave. Survive. Tell them." Daniel ran. He didn't stop, didn't look back, sprinting through roots, mud, and fog until he collapsed near the ranger station, drenched and shaking, his flashlight flickering in his grasp. Behind him, the forest was silent again, patient, waiting for the next fool to wander too far. Weeks later, Daniel would still hear the whispers on quiet nights. He would see shadows at the edge of his vision, and he would remember the glowing eyes, the vanishing footprints, the distorted shapes circling him in the mist. The forest never forgot. It never forgave, and those who dared enter too deeply often never returned. Daniel never returned to that lookout post. He never patrolled the northern ridge again. But sometimes, when the fog rises thick and the wind screams through the treetops, he can feel it watching, the forest waiting, patient and eternal, reminding him that it always keeps its own.